Knowing what you don't know is more useful than being brilliant. Charlie Munger. There's a moment that does not get talked about much because it isn't dramatic and it doesn't announce itself. It's the moment when theory stops being sufficient. Not because the theory is wrong, but because the environment changes in a way that theory alone cannot account for. You don't notice it immediately. You notice it later, in how decisions start to feel heavier. Before that moment, decisions feel reversible. You can explain them, you can justify them, you can talk through them. The systems feel intellectual. You are operating inside ideas. Once that moment passes, decisions stop feeling abstract. They gain weight. Not emotional weight in a dramatic sense, but structural weight. The cost of being wrong is no longer conceptual. It becomes real in a way that changes how your body reacts, not just how your mind reasons. Nothing external has to change for this shift to happen. The market doesn't need to do anything unusual. The strategy doesn't need to fail. The difference is internal. You realize that outcomes are no longer hypothetical. That realization quietly alters your relationship with every decision that follows. Before that shift, it's easy to believe that better thinking is the solution to most problems. More research, more context, more refinement. You feel that if you can just understand the system well enough, you will behave correctly inside it. This belief is logical. It's also incomplete. Understanding does not guarantee restraint when consequences become tangible. After that shift, you start to notice something uncomfortable. The same decisions you used to make confidently now produce hesitation. Not because you know less, but because you know more about what can go wrong. You start to feel the gap between knowing what should be done and feeling able to do it cleanly under pressure. This is the point where many people misinterpret what's happening. They assume they are losing confidence or becoming risk averse or overthinking. In reality, they are encountering the limits of ungoverned intelligence. The environment has crossed the threshold where reasoning alone is no longer enough to keep behavior coherent. One of the clearest signals of this shift is how time feels. Decisions that once felt urgent begin to feel dangerous. Speed no longer feels like an advantage. It feels like exposure. You become more aware of how often decisions are being forced, not because they are necessary, but because the system allows them. Another signal is how explanation changes. Before, you could explain decisions easily. After, explanation feels inadequate. You can still justify choices intellectually, but something feels missing. The explanation does not carry the same confidence it once did. This is no doubt. It's the recognition that explanation does not equal control. This is also when the idea of discipline starts to crack. Discipline assumes that you can reliably override internal signals when needed. And the real consequence, those signals become louder, not quieter. The nervous system does not negotiate politely, it reacts. And once you see this clearly, the idea that discipline alone will save you starts to feel naive. The most important realization in this phase is subtle. It's the understanding that the system you are operating is not testing your intelligence. It's testing your ability to maintain structure when your internal state is compromised. And without explicit structure, that test is unwinnable. This is where governance first becomes real, not as a concept, but as a necessity. You start to see that rules you can override are not rules. That intentions you can reinterpret are not constraints. That relying on future calm is not a plan. These insights do not arrive as conclusions. They arrive as pressure. Pressure reveals something else as well. Evidence was borrowed from low consequence. This is uncomfortable to admit, but important. It does not mean the thinking was wrong. It means the environment had not yet demanded proof of control. This section is not about a mistake or a failure. It's about transition. The transition from operating inside ideas to operating inside systems. From believing that understanding leads behavior to recognizing that behavior must be protected from understanding under stress. In the next section, I'm going to talk about a mistake that only became visible after this transition. Not because it was obvious, but because the environment finally made it impossible to ignore. That mistake wasn't a bad call. It was a missing constraint. The mistake I want to talk about wasn't obvious when it was happening. That's what made it dangerous. There was no single decision I could point to and say, that was wrong. At the time, everything looked reasonable. The logic was sound, the intentions were clean, the system was functioning. And that's exactly why it went unnoticed. The mistake was structural, not tactical. It wasn't about what I chose to do. It was about what I allowed myself to choose in the first place. There was a degree of freedom in the system that didn't need to be there. And under real conditions, that freedom became a liability. Before this became visible, I believed I was operating with discipline. I had rules, I had criteria, I had processes. But what I hadn't fully acknowledged was that those rules were still negotiable. They relied on my interpretation in the moment. They assumed that I would remain consistent under pressure. That assumption held only as long as the environment was forgiving. The system allowed me to intervene when things felt uncomfortable, even if intervention wasn't structurally required. That felt like flexibility. It felt like responsibility. In reality, it was a gap in governance. The system trusted my judgment at the exact moment when judgment was most likely to be compromised. Nothing catastrophic happened immediately. That's important to understand. The system didn't fail loudly. It drifted. Small adjustments were made for sensible reasons. Each adjustment was defensible on its own. Over time, the original intent of the system became less clear. Not because it was forgotten, but because it was being quietly rewritten by circumstance. The first signal that something was wrong wasn't loss. It was mental load. Decisions started to feel heavier. Not harder, just heavier. The same choices that used to feel straightforward now required more internal debate. That debate didn't produce better outcomes. It produced friction. I noticed that I was spending more time explaining decisions to myself than executing them. That's always a warning sign. Explanation is useful during design. During execution, it's often a sign that the system is asking questions it should already have answered. What made this mistake difficult to see was that it never violated my values. I wasn't breaking rules in any way that felt irresponsible. I was adapting. I was responding to information. I was staying engaged. From the outside, it would have looked like careful management. From the inside, it felt like effort. The problem is that effort is not neutral. Effort under uncertainty consumes cognitive resources. The more effort required to maintain coherence, the less resilient the system becomes. Over time, I realized that I was compensating for a missing constraint with attention. Attention is finite. Systems that depend on it eventually fail. The mistake revealed itself not through a dramatic event, but through repetition. The same pattern appeared in different contexts. Slight adjustments justified by conditions. Small exceptions framed as prudence. Each one harmless in isolation. Together, they created a system that required constant supervision to remain intact. At that point, it became clear that the issue wasn't the decisions themselves. It was the fact that I was still the enforcement mechanism. The system relied on me to say no at the right times. That's not governance. That's hope. The uncomfortable realization was this. If the system needs me to be vigilant at all times to function, it is already broken. Vigilance is not scalable. It doesn't survive fatigue, distraction, or stress. It creates a single point of failure. This mistake stayed invisible because the environment hadn't yet forced the issue. Once the environment applied pressure, the gap became obvious. Not as a crisis, but as strain. The system was working harder to produce the same outcome. That is never a good sign. Importantly, this wasn't about a lack of knowledge. I understood the risks. I could articulate them. I simply hadn't removed the option to override structure in the moment. That option existed, and under pressure, of course, it was used. This section isn't about regret. It's about recognition. Recognizing that allowing discretion where none is needed is not maturity, it's exposure. And recognizing that systems don't fail when they are wrong. They fail when they are too permissive. In the next section, I'll talk about the single constraint that changed how everything felt afterward. Not because it improved outcomes directly, but because it removed a class of decisions entirely. The change that mattered most wasn't a new insight or a better strategy. It was constraint. And not the kind of constraint that improves performance directly. The kind that removes an entire category of decisions from the system. What I did was simple, but uncomfortable. I removed my own discretion at a specific point in the process. I decided in advance that certain actions would no longer be available to me, regardless of how justified they might feel in the moment. This wasn't about being conservative. It was about being honest about when judgment is least reliable. Before that change, the system trusted me too much. It assumed that I would always know when to intervene and when not to. It assumed that I could distinguish between signal and discomfort under pressure. That assumption had already proven false. The constraint existed to correct it. What changed immediately was not outcome, but sensation. Decisions became lighter. Not easier, but lighter. There was less internal negotiation, fewer moments of, should I? The system stopped asking questions it had no business asking during execution. This is an important distinction. The constraint didn't make the system smarter. It made it quieter. And in that quiet, coherence returned. Attention was no longer consumed by monitoring optional actions. Emotional energy was conserved. The system could run without constant supervision. One of the more surprising effects was how this changed my relationship with uncertainty. Uncertainty didn't disappear, but it stopped feeling personal. When outcomes are governed, uncertainty becomes part of the system rather than reflection of your judgment. That separation matters more than most people realize. The constraint also exposed something uncomfortable. A portion of what I had previously interpreted as engagement was actually anxiety disguised as involvement. Removing discretion revealed how often action had been used to relieve discomfort rather than improve structure. That's not criticism, it's a design flaw most systems share. After the constraint was in place, the system became easier to observe. Patterns emerged more clearly because behavior was consistent. Feedback became cleaner because actions were repeatable. Learning resumed because noise was reduced. What I gave up was optionality. What I gained was durability. This is the trait most people avoid because it feels like a loss. They see constraint as limitation. In practice, it's protection. Freedom without structure feels empowering until it's tested. Structure without freedom feels restrictive until it's needed. I want to be clear about something. This wasn't about removing responsibility. Responsibility remained. What changed was how responsibility lived. It moved from the moment of execution to the moment of design. That shift is subtle, but it's everything. Once that shift happens, you stop relying on who you are in the moment and start relying on what you built beforehand. That's the difference between operating inside a system and being exposed to one. This is where Builder's log ends, for now. Not because there is a resolution, but because this is the point where explanation gives way to enforcement. The system doesn't need to be discussed further to work. It needs to be respected. Everything else I talk about on this channel, control, quadrants, governance, progression paths, connects back to this moment. The moment you accept that you cannot trust yourself equally in all conditions and that the solution is not discipline, but design. That acceptance is not weakness. It's the beginning of building systems that last. I hope that helps. If you haven't done the test, you don't know where do you fit in the crypto quadrant, you don't know what's your progression path, down below the video, there's a link. You can do the test for free and then go forward from there. I hope that helps. I'll see you in the next one. Take care.